The morning sun cast long shadows across the tree-lined streets of Georgetown. Officer Thomas Wilson adjusted his sunglasses and sipped his coffee as he cruised through the wealthy neighborhood in his patrol car. The cherry blossoms were in full bloom, their pink petals drifting across manicured lawns and luxury vehicles. Officer Wilson had been working this beat for almost 8 years. He knew most of the people who lived here, the senators, the business owners, the foreign diplomats. He took pride in keeping their streets safe, though he had certain ideas about who belonged in this neighborhood and who didn't. When the older blue sedan turned onto Maple Avenue going 43 in a 35 zone, Officer Wilson straightened, up in his seat. The car wasn't fancy like most around here, at least 15 years old with a small scratch on the back bumper. Behind the wheel sat an elderly black woman with silver hair and glasses, dressed in what looked like a dark professional outfit. Well, he muttered to himself, flipping on his lights. Let's see what we have here. The sedan pulled over smoothly, stopping perfectly against the curb. Officer Wilson called in the license plate before stepping out of his cruiser. His hand rested near his holster as he approached, a habit he'd developed over the years, especially when he felt uncertain about a situation. Inside the car, Justice Patricia Washington took a deep breath and closed her eyes for just a moment. At 72 years old, she had lived through too much to be surprised by what was happening. This was the third time she'd been pulled over in her own neighborhood since moving here 19 years ago. Each time, she had been driving under the speed limit or, at worst, just a touch over, just like many of her neighbors who never seemed to attract police attention. She had prepared for this moment countless times. As one of only 2 black women ever to serve on the nation's highest court, she had learned patience as a survival skill. She placed both hands on the steering wheel, where they could be clearly seen, and waited. Officer Wilson tapped on her window with his knuckles, harder than necessary. She rolled it down smoothly. "License and registration," he said sharply, not bothering with a greeting. His voice had an edge to it that his colleagues rarely heard when he stopped other drivers in the neighborhood. "Good morning, officer." "Justice," Washington replied calmly, her voice carrying the slight lilt of her South Carolina upbringing. "May I ask why I've been stopped?" "You were speeding," he replied curtly. "License and registration, please." She nodded and spoke clearly. "My registration is in the glove compartment and my license is in my purse on the passenger seat. I'm going to reach for them now." Officer Wilson watched her every move with suspicious eyes as she carefully retrieved the documents and handed them over. "I apologize if I was exceeding the speed limit, officer. I'm running a bit late for work this morning," she explained, her tone respectful but not submissive. Officer Wilson looked at her with skepticism. "Late for work? At your age?" He glanced around the expensive neighborhood. "Cleaning houses around here pays that well, does it?" The comment hung in the air between them. Justice Washington's expression didn't change, though something flickered, briefly in her eyes, not anger, but a weary recognition. She'd heard variations of this comment throughout her life, even after graduating top of her class at Harvard Law, even after arguing before the Supreme Court, even after being nominated to sit on it. "I do work," she replied simply, neither correcting his assumption nor revealing her position. "And I would prefer not to be later than I already am." The street was quiet except for birds chirping and sprinklers ticking away on nearby lawns. A jogger passed by, slowing slightly to look at the scene. A police officer standing over an elderly black woman in a car that didn't quite match the neighborhood's usual vehicles. "Wait here," Officer Wilson said, taking her documents back to his patrol car. Justice Washington watched him in her rearview mirror. Her fingers tapped once, twice on the steering wheel, the only sign of her frustration. On her back seat lay a black judicial robe and a garment bag and a stack of legal briefs she had been reviewing until late last night. In 3 hours, she was supposed to hear oral arguments in a case about, ironically, police search procedures. She thought about the young law clerk waiting at her office, probably wondering where she was. She thought about calling him but decided against reaching for her phone. No sudden movements. That was another lesson she had learned long ago, a lesson she shouldn't still need in her own neighborhood, in front of her own home, at her age and position. Outside, unaware of who he had pulled over, Officer Wilson ran her license through the system, expecting, perhaps even hoping, to find something that would justify his suspicion. Many officers on the force knew that Thomas Wilson had certain views about who belonged where. He wasn't the worst on the force, not by far, but he had blind spots he refused to acknowledge. As he waited for the computer to respond, he rehearsed in his mind what he might say next. Maybe he'd let her off with a warning if she was appropriately apologetic. Maybe he'd write her up for the full amount if she gave him any attitude. The choice was his, and the power felt comfortable in his hands. Then the computer beeped with its response, and Officer Wilson's comfortable world tilted sideways. Officer Wilson stared at his patrol car computer screen, then blinked and read it again. The information couldn't be right. He tapped a few keys, thinking he'd made an error. The screen showed a completely clean driving record, not even a parking ticket. But that wasn't what made his stomach drop. According to the system, Patricia Washington wasn't just any ordinary citizen. She was Associate Justice Patricia Washington of the United States Supreme Court, appointed 17 years ago by a former president after a distinguished 30-year career as a civil rights attorney and federal judge. "You've got to be kidding me," he whispered to himself, his throat suddenly dry. The photo on his screen matched the woman sitting patiently in the car ahead. The system also showed her home address, right here on this very street, in the large brick house with white columns that he'd driven past hundreds of times. Officer Wilson felt heat rising from his collar to his face. Sweat formed at his temples. Despite the car's air conditioning, he had just accused one of the most powerful legal minds in the country of cleaning houses. The realization made him feel slightly sick. He sat there for several long moments trying to decide what to do. His usual script wouldn't work here. Should he apologize? Pretend it never happened? Give her a ticket anyway to show he wasn't intimidated? In the sedan, Justice Washington checked her watch. Court would begin in 2 hours and 15 minutes. She had hoped to review her notes once more before the session began. Through her rearview mirror, she could see Officer Wilson still sitting in his patrol car. She noticed how he kept looking at his screen and then up at her car, his body language shifting from confident to uncertain. She had been in this position before, watching someone realize who she was and scramble to adjust their behavior. Sometimes it brought satisfaction, sometimes just tiredness. Today, she felt something different, an opportunity. Finally, Officer Wilson gathered her documents and walked back to her car. His stride was different now, hesitant, almost shuffling. When she rolled down her window, his face wore an entirely new expression. "Ma'am, Your Honor, he stammered, handing back her license and registration with slightly shaky hands. "Everything seems to be in order." Justice Washington accepted her documents without comment, waiting. "I apologize for the delay," he continued, his voice unnaturally high. "You're free to go, of course. Have a nice day at, work." She placed her documents carefully in her purse, taking her time. When she looked up at him, her gaze was direct but not unkind. "Is there a problem with my documentation, Officer Wilson?" she asked quietly. No problem at all, Your Honor," he said quickly. "I'm terribly sorry to have bothered you this morning." A young mother pushing a stroller walked by on the sidewalk, glancing curiously at them. The neighborhood was waking, up around them. Garage doors opening, sprinklers turning on, people collecting newspapers from driveways. "Then may I ask why I was pulled over?" Justice Washington persisted. "You mentioned speeding, but I'm quite certain I was driving at or very near the limit." Officer Wilson shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "It's possible the radar had an error," he offered weakly. "These machines aren't always accurate." "I see," she replied. "And would you have stopped a silver BMW driving at the same speed?" The question hung in the air between them. It wasn't accusatory in tone, more like a question she might ask during oral arguments, giving the attorney rope to either climb up or hang himself. "I stop anyone who breaks the law," he said defensively, but his eyes didn't meet hers. "Of course," she nodded. "The law should apply equally to everyone. That's something I think about every day in my work." At the mention of her work, Officer Wilson's face flushed deeper. "I truly didn't realize who you were when I pulled you over, Your Honor." "And would it matter who I am?" she asked. "Should justice be applied differently based on a person's position or title?" Officer Wilson had no ready answer for this. He'd been a police officer for 12 years, and no traffic stop had ever gone like this. Usually, he was the one asking the questions, the one with the power to decide outcomes. "No, ma'am," he finally said. "Justice should be blind." "But it isn't always, is it?" she observed, her tone conversational rather than confrontational. "Sometimes what we see, or think we see, affects our judgment before we have all the facts." Bead of sweat trickled down Officer Wilson's back. This wasn't an angry citizen threatening to call his supervisor. This was a Supreme Court justice giving him a gentle but firm lesson in constitutional principles right here on the street. "I'm going to be late for work, Officer Wilson," Justice Washington said, glancing at her watch again. "There are some important cases on the docket today." "Of course, Your Honor. Sorry again for the delay." As he turned to go, she called after him. "Officer Wilson?" He turned back, expecting the worst. Perhaps she would be calling the police chief or the mayor. "Yes, Your Honor?" "I would appreciate your badge number and full name for my records," she said, pulling out a small notebook from her purse. His heart sank as he provided the information, watching as she wrote it down carefully with a silver pen. The same hands that signed Supreme Court opinions that became the law of the land were now recording his name and badge number. "Thank you, officer," she said when she finished writing. "I believe we all have something to learn about how justice works in practice versus theory, don't you?" Before he could formulate a response, she had rolled up her window and driven away, leaving Officer Wilson standing alone on the curb, his certainties shaken, wondering what consequences awaited him. For the rest of his shift, Officer Wilson couldn't shake the feeling that something big was about to happen. Every time his radio crackled, he expected to hear the chief calling him in. His lunch sat heavy in his stomach, barely touched. By afternoon, rumors had already spread through the department that Wilson had pulled over a Supreme Court justice and made some unfortunate comments. When his shift ended at 4 p.m., there were no official reprimands yet, but the sideways glances from fellow officers told him the story was making rounds. He changed out of his uniform slowly, wondering if this would be the last time he'd wear it. Meanwhile, across town in the Supreme Court building, Justice Washington sat in her chambers, her glasses perched on the end of her nose as she reviewed notes from the day's proceedings. A gentle knock came at her door. "Come in," she called. Her clerk, Anthony, a bright young man from Michigan, entered with a stack of papers. "Today's summaries, Your Honor," he said, placing them on her desk. "Justice." Washington nodded her thanks, then removed her glasses. "Anthony, could you do something for me? I need information on an Officer Thomas Wilson from the Georgetown Police Precinct." Anthony looked surprised but didn't question her. "Of course, Your Honor. Anything specific you're looking for?" "His record. Complaints filed. Commendations received. Stop statistics if they're available." "Is everything all right, Your Honor?" Anthony asked, concern in his voice. Justice Washington smiled slightly. "Just doing some research, Anthony. And please, find out who oversees community relations at that precinct." After Anthony left, Justice Washington turned to look out her window at the Washington Monument in the distance. The morning's incident wasn't the first time she'd been profiled, and at 72, she was tired of it happening. But she hadn't spent decades in the legal system without learning that how you responded to injustice mattered as much as the response itself. 3 days later, Officer Wilson was called into the station on his day off. His stomach dropped when he saw the police chief's serious expression. "Wilson, my office," Chief Rodriguez said, not waiting for a response before turning and walking away. In the office, Wilson was surprised to find not only the chief but also Captain Patel from Internal Affairs. On the desk lay a folder with his name on it. "Sit down," Chief Rodriguez said, gesturing to the empty chair. Wilson lowered himself slowly, his uniform feeling tight around his neck despite the top button being open. "I assume you know why you're here," the chief began. "The traffic stop with Justice Washington," Wilson replied, his voice quieter than usual. 3 days ago, you pulled over a Supreme Court justice in front of her own home, Captain Patel said, opening the folder. According to your report, it was for going 8 miles over the speed limit. Wilson nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Interesting thing about that stretch of road, the chief continued. We installed new speed monitoring equipment there last month. Records every car that passes. Justice Washington's vehicle was recorded going 37 in a 35. That's 2 miles over, not 8. Wilson's face grew hot. The radar in my car must have been off. Or something else was off, Captain Patel suggested. She slid some papers across the desk. Wilson glanced down to see statistics of his traffic stops over the past year. The numbers were stark when laid out this way. He had pulled over minority drivers at a rate 3 times higher than his colleagues, even though the overall demographics of drivers in his patrol area didn't support that difference. I'm not, Wilson stammered, but the evidence was right there in black and white. Justice Washington hasn't filed an official complaint, Chief Rodriguez said. Yet. The yet hung in the air like a guillotine blade. Instead, Captain Patel continued, she's requested a meeting with you at the Supreme Court. Wilson's head snapped up. She wants to meet with me? Why? That's what we'd like to know, the chief replied. This could go several ways, Wilson. Best case, she wants to give you a stern talking to in person. Worst case, she's building evidence for a formal discrimination case against you and the department. Wilson felt the blood drain from his face. His career, his pension, his reputation, all could be destroyed. And somewhere deep inside, beneath his defensiveness, he knew he'd deserve it. The meeting is scheduled for tomorrow at 2 p.m., Captain Patel said. You'll go in uniform. You'll be respectful. And Wilson, you'll be honest. The next day, Officer Wilson stood on the steps of the Supreme Court building, looking up at its imposing columns. Tourists snapped photos around him, some giving curious glances to the police officer who seemed frozen in place. His palms were sweaty despite the cool spring air. Finally, he climbed the steps and went through security. A court officer escorted him through marble hallways to an ornate waiting area outside Justice Washington's chambers. Officer Wilson, a voice called. He turned to see Anthony, the clerk. Justice Washington will see you now. Wilson followed him into a spacious office, lined with law books. Large windows let in streams of afternoon sunlight. Behind a massive oak desk sat Justice Washington, now dressed in a navy suit instead of her judicial robes. She looked exactly as she had in her car, yet somehow different, more in her element, more powerful. Officer Wilson, she said, rising, slightly in greeting. Thank you for coming. Your Honor, he managed to say, standing stiffly. Please sit, she offered, gesturing to a chair across from her desk. Wilson sat, noticing framed photos on her desk. Family pictures, one with a former president, another of her receiving her law degree decades ago. I imagine you're wondering why I asked you here, she began. Wilson nodded, his mouth too dry for words. I could have filed a complaint, she continued. Some of my clerks thought I should. Several of my colleagues agreed. Wilson braced himself. But I've spent my life trying to change systems, Officer Wilson. And systems don't change just by punishing individuals. She leaned forward, folding her hands on her desk. Tell me, why did you stop me that morning? The directness of the question caught him off guard. He'd rehearsed diplomatic answers all night. But facing her now, those prepared responses felt hollow. He paused, then decided on the truth. You didn't look like you belonged in that neighborhood. She nodded, not angry but thoughtful. And what does someone who belongs there look like? The question hung between them like a weight. For the first time, Wilson truly examined his assumptions, seeing them from the outside. The silence stretched between them as Officer Wilson struggled with Justice Washington's question. What did someone who belonged in Georgetown look like? The answer that first came to mind made him uncomfortable now. I guess, he finally said. I thought people there would be wealthier, drive nicer cars. He hesitated, then added with painful honesty, and I thought they'd be white. Justice Washington nodded, her expression unreadable. "Thank you for your honesty, Officer Wilson. That's a good place to start." She rose from her desk and walked to a small side table where a coffee pot sat. "Would you like some coffee?" The ordinary gesture surprised him. "Yes, thank you," he said, grateful for the momentary break in tension. As she poured 2 cups, Wilson noticed a large leather-bound book on her desk. The United States Constitution. Justice Washington handed him a cup and returned to her seat. "Officer Wilson, I didn't ask you here to shame you or to end your career." He looked up confused. "You didn't?" "No," she said. "I asked you here because I believe in the possibility of growth. I've seen it throughout my career. People capable of change when given the chance to learn." She took a sip of her coffee. "I have a proposal for you. The court is about to hear arguments on a case about police procedures and racial bias. Very relevant to our encounter. I'd like you to observe the proceedings." Wilson blinked in surprise. "You want me to watch a Supreme Court case?" "Yes," she nodded. "Tomorrow morning. My clerk Anthony will arrange everything. After the arguments, we'll talk again." The next day found Officer Wilson sitting in the back row of the Supreme Court chamber, still not entirely sure why he was there. The room was more magnificent than he'd imagined. High ceilings, red curtains, polished wood, and 9 impressive chairs for the justices. As the room filled with lawyers, journalists, and observers, Wilson felt out of place in his uniform. AD. Few people glanced curiously at him. At precisely 10 a.m. a voice called out, "All rise," and the 9 Supreme Court justices entered in their black robes, Justice Washington among them. Seeing her in this context, respected, powerful in her element, was a stark contrast to how he'd seen her in her car. For the next 2 hours, Wilson listened as lawyers presented arguments about a case involving a man who claimed he had been racially profiled during a traffic stop that led to his arrest. The legal language was sometimes difficult to follow, but the core issue was clear. When does an officer's perception cross the line into bias? When is a routine stop not routine at all? Justice Washington asked pointed questions of both sides, her voice calm but persistent. If we accept that unconscious bias exists, how do we distinguish between legitimate law enforcement and discriminatory practices? Wilson found himself leaning forward, listening intently. These weren't abstract issues anymore. They were directly related to his work, his choices, his career. When the session ended, Anthony led Wilson to a small conference room where lunch had been set up. "Justice Washington will join you shortly," he explained before leaving. Wilson sat alone, thinking about what he'd heard. 20 minutes later, Justice Washington entered, now in a regular business suit rather than her robe. "What did you think?" she asked, taking a seat across from him. "It was eye-opening," Wilson admitted. "I've never thought about these issues from such different perspectives." She nodded, unwrapping her sandwich. "That's why I wanted you to be here. In my chambers, we only consider one case at a time, but you make dozens of judgment calls, every day on the street." They ate in silence for a moment before she continued. "Officer Wilson, let me tell you a story. When I was a young lawyer, I represented a boy who had been arrested for looking suspicious near a store that had been robbed. He spent 3 nights in jail before anyone realized he had been at school when the robbery happened." Wilson felt a knot form in his stomach. "That case taught me something important," she continued. "Systems are made of people, and people can learn. That officer who arrested my client wasn't a bad person. He was doing what he thought was his job, based on what he'd been taught to look for." She looked directly at Wilson. "The question is, once we know better, will we do better?" After lunch, Justice Washington surprised him again. "I'd like to show you something else," she said, leading him down a hallway to a small museum-like room filled with historical legal documents. "This is the original copy of Plessy v. Ferguson," she said, pointing to a document in a glass case. "The 1896 separate but equal ruling that justified segregation for decades." They moved to another display. "And this is Brown v. Board of Education, which overturned it. Same Constitution, different understanding. As they walked through legal history, Justice Washington explained how the law had evolved, sometimes forward, sometimes backward, based on people's willingness to examine their assumptions. The law isn't perfect, she said quietly. It's a human institution, reflecting human understanding at a particular moment. The question is whether we're willing to look at it with fresh eyes when new information comes to light. By late afternoon, they had returned to her chambers. Wilson felt mentally exhausted but strangely energized. "I have one more thing to show you," Justice Washington said, opening a drawer in her desk. She pulled out a folder and handed it to him. Inside was information about a community program in Georgetown, a monthly meeting between police officers and neighborhood residents of all backgrounds. The next page showed statistics from precincts that had implemented similar programs, showing improved community relations and more equitable policing outcomes. "I've been a mentor for this program for years," she explained. "We need officers who are willing to participate, to listen, and to share their perspectives." Wilson looked up from the folder. "Is this what you want from me?" Justice Washington leaned back in her chair. "Officer Wilson, I could file a complaint against you. It would go in your record. You might face disciplinary action. And nothing would really change. Not for you, not for the next person who gets pulled over because they don't look like they belong." She folded her hands. "Or you could join this program. Learn, share your experiences, help make things better." Wilson swallowed hard. "Why would you give me this chance?" Justice Washington's eyes were kind but serious. "Because justice isn't just about punishment," she said. "Sometimes it's about growth. We all have biases, Officer Wilson. The question is what we do when we recognize them." She stood up, signaling the end of their meeting. "You don't have to decide right now. Think about it. Let my clerk know your decision by Friday." As Officer Wilson left the Supreme Court building, stepping back into the late afternoon sunlight, he felt like a different person than the one who had turned on his patrol car lights just days ago. He looked down at the folder in his hands, already knowing what his answer would be. 6 months passed. The community center on Pine Street buzzed with conversation as people took their seats in a circle. Officer Wilson, wearing his uniform but looking more relaxed than he once did in it, helped an elderly man find a chair. "Thanks, Tom," the man said with a smile. "These old knees aren't what they used to be." Wilson nodded warmly. "No problem, Mr. Chen. We saved you a spot near the coffee." Around the room, about 30 people gathered: shop owners, students, retirees, and 5 other police officers. The group reflected the diversity that existed in Georgetown but that Wilson had somehow never fully seen before. As people settled in, Wilson checked his watch. She was always exactly on time. At 7:01 p.m. sharp, Justice Washington entered the sign room. Though she wasn't wearing her judicial robes, there was still something commanding about her presence. She carried a folder under one arm and greeted several people by name as she made her way to the center. "Good evening, everyone," she said, her voice carrying easily through the room. "Thank you for joining our monthly community dialogue." She glanced around the circle, her eyes landing briefly on Wilson with a small nod of acknowledgement. "Tonight, we've asked Officer Wilson to share some thoughts on the changes he's observed since our program began." Wilson felt a flutter of nervousness as he stood. Public speaking had never been his strength, but over the months he'd grown more comfortable with these gatherings. "6 months ago," he began, "I pulled someone over because they didn't fit what I thought belonged in a certain neighborhood." He paused, still finding it hard to admit. That someone turned out to be Justice Washington. A few smiles and knowing looks passed between the regulars who had heard parts of this story before. "I could have lost my job that day," Wilson continued. "Instead, I was given a chance to learn and to change. These monthly meetings have shown me things I never saw clearly before. How different people experience the same neighborhood, the same laws, the same police presence in completely different ways." He glanced at his fellow officers. "When I Joined the force 12 years ago. I thought I understood what it meant to protect and serve, but I was only seeing part of the picture. Wilson pulled a folded paper from his pocket. 3 months ago, our precinct started tracking data differently, looking at who we pull over and why. The numbers don't lie. He unfolded the paper. In my own stops, there's been a 40% decrease in racial disparity, and guess what? I'm still catching the same number of actual lawbreakers. A quiet murmur of approval went through the room. But statistics only tell part of the story, Wilson added. The real change is harder to measure. It's in how I approach, each day on patrol now asking myself different questions. It's in the conversations I'm having with other officers back at the station. From the back of the room, Captain Patel, who had come to observe, nodded slightly. She had been skeptical at first, but couldn't argue with the results. After Wilson sat down, others shared their experiences. A college student describing a positive interaction with police after her car broke down. A store owner discussing how community officers had helped de-escalate a situation with a troubled teenager. An elderly woman expressing how she still felt nervous when police cars slowed near. Her grandson. Each story added a thread to the complex tapestry they were weaving together. Not all were positive, but all were honest. As the official meeting ended and people broke into smaller conversations over coffee and cookies, Wilson noticed Justice Washington speaking with a young officer who had joined the program recently. The young woman was listening intently, nodding. Wilson smiled to himself, remembering how resistant he had been at first. Now he found himself mentoring newer officers, challenging them to examine their assumptions the way Justice Washington had challenged his. "Officer Wilson," a voice called. He turned to see Justice Washington approaching. "Your Honor," he said with genuine respect. "That was quite a speech," she said. 40% improvement is significant." Wilson nodded. "It's just the beginning." They moved toward the window, slightly away from the crowd. Outside, streetlights illuminated the sidewalk where people from all walks of life passed by. "I've been meaning to tell you," Wilson said. "Next month I'm starting a training program at the academy, teaching new recruits about community-based policing and implicit bias." Justice Washington's eyebrows rose slightly. "That's excellent news." "It was Captain Patel's idea," Wilson admitted. "She thinks my story might make an impact on the new officers before they develop habits." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment. "You know," Wilson said finally, "that day when you pulled out your notebook and wrote down my badge number, I thought my life was over." Justice Washington smiled. "And now?" "Now I think it was just beginning," he replied. "A different life than I had planned, but a better one." She nodded thoughtfully. "The law can change behavior," she said, "but only understanding can change hearts." From across the room, Anthony, her clerk who had become a regular at these meetings, signaled that her car was waiting. As Justice Washington prepared to leave, she paused. "Officer Wilson, there's a case coming before the court next month about police training standards. Would you be interested in attending the arguments? Your perspective might be valuable afterward." Wilson felt a surge of pride at being asked. "I'd be honored, Your Honor." After she left, Wilson stayed to help stack chairs. Mr. Chen approached him, leaning on his cane. "You're doing good work, officer," the old man said. "My grandson tells me he doesn't cross the street anymore when he sees a patrol car coming." Wilson felt something catch in his throat. "That means a lot, sir." Later that night, driving home in his personal car, not his patrol vehicle, Wilson took the long route through Georgetown. He passed the spot where he had pulled over Justice Washington half a year ago. What might have been just another traffic stop, another chance to assert his authority, had instead become a turning point. At a red light, Wilson watched as people from all backgrounds crossed at the intersection. Students heading home from study sessions, restaurant workers ending late shifts, residents walking their dogs. Each with their own story, their own place, in the community. The light turned green and Wilson continued on, seeing the neighborhood and his role in it through new eyes. Not perfect eyes, but better ones. Eyes that were still learning to truly see.